Inclusion.
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 Inclusion. Inclusion.
Inclusion podcast by the Centre for Inclusive Leadership.
Hello, welcome along to Inclusion Podcast. I'm so thrilled you're joining us for this Black History Month edition, and we have a special guest for you, none other than Onyekachi Wambu, who is the compiler of the 75th anniversary edition, your anthology, the second of these anthologies, of course. You did one for the 50th, didn't you?
Yes.
Called Windrush. Please have a look. And if you haven't got this, you need to go and get it. So have a look at this book, Windrush. And not only do we have Onyekachi with us, who is the compiler, but we also happen to have one of the contributors, our very own Chantelle Dusette, who, by the way, when I read all these stories, I got to your one and I went, this is so different. It's so fabulous. It's so brilliant. So super excited to talk to you, Chantelle, about your contribution. And perhaps we can get into that in a minute. But Onyekachi has a great history. A journalist, of course, writer, directed television for Channel 4, BBC as well, I believe, right? Mm-hmm. And you've worked with people like Lord John Taylor, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, who's an old friend of mine. So that's fun to see that when I read that on your notes. And we're just honestly so thrilled to have you with us. So I want to jump right in, if I may. And when I read the book, apart from that, I was delighted by it. I cannot begin to tell you how much fun I found this. The Bernardine story at the beginning about I've forgotten the title of it now.
Emperor's Babe.
Oh my goodness. I just thought that is so fantastic. But there was something I liked in the Windrush moment, and it just seems so relevant for me as an inclusion practitioner. There's an African proverb that introduces that theme for us. And the African proverb essentially says this, and it's placed so nicely at the front of this section. It says, home is not just where you live, it's the place where you belong. And I thought that was just priceless, because one of the themes that comes very strongly through the book when you read it is the idea of us as the diaspora, as a people that are kind of homeless at home. And I think that's a really interesting idea. But why did you pick that particular proverb as part of the presentation? Because it struck me as being brilliant.
Yeah, so I mean, the book is really about multiple migrations, voluntary and involuntary. And how people have attempted, every time they move, to find home, to be settled, to remake themselves afresh. And the way that I've structured the book was really a little bit in response to the way that Windrush is currently being packaged, almost as kind of the Mayflower in return, or Columbus's discovery in reverse, where it's being seen as the first time that people of African descent arrive in the UK. And of course it's not. It's part of a much longer story of and some of it very tragic and some of it very painful, of, the involuntary kidnapping and then trafficking of people to the Caribbean to be enslaved, and then later on the emancipation, and then what then happens in that moment, or the home of the Caribbean, and then finally in 48 when they come to England, looking for fresh opportunities and to remake themselves. So I wanted that proverb to sort of resonate and trigger conversations about home and homelessness.
And I think you do that brilliantly. And the way the anthology is compiled, I love the 4 sections, which of course ends futuristically, doesn't it? Where Chantal's contribution sits.
Yes,
so maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But the other thing I think was interesting, and it's a curious thing, isn't it? Because you pick up a story like Empire Windrush and you think to yourself, oh yes, you've got the date in 1948, you've got it clear in your mind. You could almost be forgiven for thinking that actually that was the Empire Windrush's maiden voyage as well, right? And then one of the things I found very interesting about the book was how you talk about actually part of it is the story of the ship itself. And of course, what is just breathtaking is when you suddenly realize, you mean this ship was previously named something else, and part of what it was doing was in battles against us in the world in the Second World War, and then there's this extraordinary business about
ferrying Jews to the camps.
Auschwitz, Norwegian Jews to Auschwitz. I was thinking, what in the world? But what I found fascinating about it was how its history was steeped in this dark history. So this battleship, this ship that had attacked the British, then this ship that had shipped Norwegian Jews to their deaths was the same ship. Do you describe it in the book as cleansed or something? It was a very. I thought it was very clever. I thought it was very smart the way you said that.
I mean, it has to be. I mean, after doing that.
Very interesting.
So yeah.
But yet, it seemed to me the point you make in the book feel really freighted, because it was like, and then they bring this Caribbean cargo to the United Kingdom, to our shores at Tilbury. Of course, the analogy, of course, it would stretch it too far, but that notion of bringing those people not necessarily into this great freedom, but into something that wasn't quite what it was.
And the resonance with the past, and the good ship Jesus,
very strong.
400 years earlier. So
it's very strong.
So the idea is just about arrivals and goings and comings and different kinds of cargo.
And I think it's really clever. I think the theme is very clever, and I love this idea of how you've got this notion of all of the colonial peoples coming back to centre. I thought that was actually very interesting. And then what happens when that is there. But tell us about because the book's done in 4 themes essentially, isn't it? 4. Could you talk to us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, we look at the first theme, which is really before Windrush. So it's there's I'm trying to capture how people of African origin and others who were part of the empire have seen Britain, seen themselves, and that whole kind of process of trying to understand yourself in that stuff. So the first section is really about a whole group of people before who arrived from Africa, like Phyllis Wheatley and Equino, and how they begin to see the new world, and to follow them as they become aware of what they find, being objectified, going through the slave experience. So we hear their accounts. Phyllis Wheatley deals with it through poetry, and and becomes this unique voice who, at a point where people were saying that Africans were couldn't think or write, and she was producing this exquisite poetry. So, and then Equino obviously talks about his journey, and so there's that first arrival to England. Which happens in the middle of the 18th century. So, and he of course arrives on another ship, and then we have Mary Prince, who also arrives again. This time, the slave trade. We say trade. I think we need to be careful about language. The slave trafficking had stopped. That institution had stopped after 1807. But the institution doesn't end until 1833. So you have this strange interregnum where you're no longer able to transport enslaved people. But the enslaved people were still enslaved on the plantations. And so she belongs to a family on the plantation. She describes her life in this account. And then one of the families who later on enslave her decide that they're going to come to the UK. So they bring her along.
They bring her, don't they? Yeah,
as an enslaved person. And then you get this strange discussion about her status, because of course she arrives here and wants to leave the family as a free person, and then they're arguing that she's still their property. And then there's a case about whether in the UK, you can have enslaved people or people as property. And so you see that whole idea of how, in the UK, and that law that case had been tested anyway in the Mansfield case, perhaps 50, 60 years earlier. And, the ruling was that you can't have enslaved people in the UK. But she's going through that again to try and win her rights. And you always get that sense of the laws in the metropole and then what happens somewhere else, and people's status never being quite the same between those two places. And of course, here we are in the last 10, 15 years where people arrive with the Windrush scandal and their status is still not.
It's just extraordinary.
So you just have these repetitions and that happen again and again and again. And we also see it with the US where, you can offshore a lack of freedom and liberty with Guantanamo Bay. So again, you have these places on the islands where, you can continue holding people in a way that would not be tolerated. Of course, they can't bring those people back onto, the US mainland because suddenly, habeas corpus and, their rights would kick in. But you can hold them in this garrison in Guantanamo Bay. And Mary Prince essentially moves from the garrison to the mainland.
That story is brilliant. Yeah. Tell me about with this section that Chantelle's contributed to. What were you thinking about with that? I'd be interested to know a little bit about what you wrote, Chantelle.
Yeah. Well, that was the first section, which is these voices. The second section, very quickly, was really about once people are on the islands, it was about the making of the islands and as an economy and the impact on people, and and so we have some brilliant essays from C.L.R. Jones and Jan Carew about how of that process of industrialization of the sugar economy.
Yes, that was superb.
The role of Africans in there, and then that economy forces people to revolt constantly, and of course the first major successful revolt. I mean, there was smaller ones, but where the Africans captured the state is obviously the Haitian Revolution. And from that moment, different kinds and ideas of freedom are possible. And so that, that section is called Writing Freedom, but it's also about the role of writers in that process of trying to define freedom, and African writers from the Caribbean, particularly, who have been really influential. Aimé Césaire, Fanon, C.L.R. James himself, of course. So you get those huge philosophers and theoreticians. And then the third section is a Windrush movement. Yeah. And then Chantelle's section is really looking at the future. Where are we going to be in another sort of 100 years, 200 years? What happens to that African descended voice in all of that? And I was interested in that because what I had noticed in doing that very long overview and journey through that experience is that, Black populations arrive in the UK, African populations arrive in the UK, and between 2 and 3 generations, they've disappeared in the past. Through intermarriage and and so I was kind of interested what happens with this next cohort of people who have arrived.
Chantelle, so your contributions, we said, is the future facing. What were you thinking about when you were writing?
Well, it was great to talk with you, with Onyekachi, when we started thinking about this story of utopia, and it was really a comment on where I think we might be with the race conversation in sort of 75 years' time. And it's interesting what you said about, I guess people sort of dying out and then you get sort of integration. And I was thinking about this the other day and I thought, actually, with so much integration that we probably will just have, the dominance of being sort of mixed ethnicities, but then you think about, well, actually, hang on a minute, people aren't really having more children. So it might not be like that in the end. It might work a different way, but that's a different conversation. But you just made me think about that. But I think it all comes into this race conversation and how we are much more mixed. And I think that's lovely. And I guess the idea was that, forgive me, it's it's a bit of a strap line, but it's essentially about this female identifying biracial woman who is a ghost, who is a time-travelling ghost from the 18th century and goes 75 years into the future from now. And it's about what she's learned on her journey.
Oh, nice.
Travelling through time, and she can move anywhere because she's a ghost, so she has the freedom to do that. And actually, it's a bit of a warning sign, because when I started to really think about this, I felt that we moved quite forward in a lot of conversations, but it feels like the race one is the one that it moves a little bit and then it's like sort of stops, where it's kind of like, well, we've pushed it as far as it can go and now everyone should sort of be okay with it. It never really feels like it gets real progression. And I thought, how do we actually solve for this issue of racism? And where I felt, and it's a bit dispiriting, but where I got to was, I just think it's just too intoxicating for a lot of people, enough people, for it not to really move forward. I think it's such a comfort blanket for some that it just warms them, this need to feel better than somebody because they're not black. That's kind of where I got to in my head with it. And I thought, oh, that's really strange. But it's where I sort of sat with it and I thought, how do we move this forward? How do we move forward with this? And so I thought the only way we could really do it is if we had to wipe out the memories of it and just restart. Because I just don't...
So you did a whole sort of system reset.
Yeah. I just didn't feel that we would be able to do that with each other in real terms. I felt like we'd have to sort of just kind of reset it.
How very interesting. How very interesting. It's fascinating, though, that you talk about the notion of that struggle, because one of the things that really hooked me when I started reading the book originally was in your introduction. There's a discussion in your introduction. It's a recollection, really, and it's something that had given you pause, where you talk about this interview you've done with a local radio journalist in the BBC. And you've been asked about why you'd written the book, and more particularly, the point I think you make so nicely, and it really provoked me to thought, was as a conspicuously African person, I think is the language you use, why were you writing this book about Windrush? And it was kind of interesting because I kind of read that and thought, when saw the book originally, I thought, yeah, why are you writing a book about Windrush? That's my book, right? And there was part of me that was thinking to myself, at whatever level, I'm not sure how conscious this level is, but whatever level, there was part of me thinking, yeah, but we're Caribbeans, right? And you folks are African. This is not your thing. And I was really taken by that, and I was taken by your sense as I read it. Perhaps you'll get me right on this. That you felt that you need to kind of repair that and restore this sense of this us and theming that has been allowed to creep in. That somehow you're Africans and we're Caribbeans. And to tell you a very, very brief story, I recently did some ancestry work, right? And the whole long story, I won't bore you with the reason why I did it, but it's a long story. But the thing arrives with my ancestry, and I was super excited. And I thought, I know what I'm going to read. I've got this Irish mother, so I'm going to say it's Irish family here. That's great. And then the rest of my ancestry is going to be just Jamaican, because I've got a Jamaican father. That's good, fine. So I'm reading through it, and it says, mother's ancestry, Northern Europe. And I go, yeah, that's good. Hone it in, Ireland, yeah, all over that. And then father's ancestry, it says Nigerian, Sierra Leone. I'm thinking, hang on, they've obviously got this wrong. I'm a Jamaican, what's going on? And it really struck me for the first time saying, do you not understand how you people got here? Why do you think you're going to have Jamaican on your heritage? You're an African. And it was like, I'm an African. I'm in a child of the 70s. I'm a what now? And it was really, so when I read your book, I thought, oh yeah, this reminds me of something. So please talk to me about that, because I thought that was so
of course,
interesting.
the Rastas and others had made that reconnection in the 70s with with their whole attempts to reconnect
Of
and
course,
go
of
home.
course.
So that conversation has been going on. It's been going on with Garvey. It's been, there's
course.
been a very, but yes, I mean, the point is that it was Africans who left Africa, who peopled
Imagine
those
that.
places. So one of the things that the book is getting me to or the way I frame the book is to now start talking about what I'm calling the African Atlantic.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
And we have been used to, for the last 500 years, the Euro-Atlantic, because Columbus makes this breakthrough, and then everything follows after Columbus. But the making of that world was, at least three big civilizations, I would argue, went into creating this Atlantic space or Euro-Atlantic space. So the Europeans did what they did, and then African labor was critical. It's never discussed as being critical.
But it's critical, isn't it?
But it's critical in culture and everything else. And then obviously the land, resources, and the native peoples of the Americas. So you've got this triangle and it was a triangle. So, but the African end of it and the Native American end has not really been discussed that much. And I think increasingly, even in popular cultures, it's now being much more kind of looked at, and you get, the latest Black Panther Wakanda movie is essentially that, which is how do you deal with, the legacies of enslavement and what happens also to the native populations, and how do you begin to have this conversation with the European part of that Atlantic. So it's for me, it's, if we don't understand it as an African Atlantic, we miss the boat. Ekweno, Phyllis Wheatley, they leave Africa. Ekweno arrives in the Caribbean, so he's a Caribbean man. He he lives in America, so he's an American man, and then he ends up in London. And the only way you really understand him is as an African Atlantic personality.
I think that's such a nice
which
idea.
is what we all are.
I think that's such a nice idea.
No, I was going to say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't American Indian Native Americans, Native Americans, did they not end up owning slaves as well?
Yeah,
at a point.
A lot of complicated things happened.
Yeah, no, just
in the Atlantic. I'm not saying that one side were terrible and all. So yeah,
No.
So sometimes that happened, but on the whole, it didn't.
Right. Okay.
Because of the economic structure and the social structure. So some people of African descent also owned other people of African descent. I mean, it was an economic system.
Right.
But we also know who was at the top of the hierarchy and who constructed that economic system.
Yeah, of course.
And that economic system and the power that it's had over the last 500 years over the globe. The interesting thing about all these conversations now is that actually that Atlantic moment is in decline, and it's visibly in decline. And somebody noted that I think it was in 1985, up until 1985, for about 200-300 years, the biggest flows of trade were between Europe and the Americas. And then in 1985, it was between the Americas and so it was across the Atlantic. So after 85, it was between the Americas and Asia. So it was across the Pacific. And in the next 10, 15 years, it will be within Asia. So all these bits are going to declining, and a lot of all these conflicts we're seeing are as a result of that.
We talked at the beginning, and I asked you about the belonging piece that I liked so much from the proverb. Again, if I may just relate back to inclusion, because it's such a key area for us. We talk a lot about psychological safety, which is a thing we talk about, and of course, and linked to belonging, which is why I liked it so much. How inclusive do you think the UK has become since Windrush? Or maybe particularly since the Windrush scandal. Let's do that.
I've been asked this question every time I've been out.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I've been out on the road, and it's a complicated question. I mean, there are people in the audience sometimes who say, "Oh, nothing has happened." Of course, a lot has happened. We have a Prime Minister of Indian heritage.
Yeah.
The First Minister of Scotland is a Muslim of Pakistani heritage. So something has happened, which would suggest that the society has opened up, that the society is more accepting in lots of different ways. But then you also have to read into why all those things are happening. I think some of it is linked to this decline that I'm talking about in the West, and the need that it also has to recalibrate and admit to a lot of the forces that have shaped it. Yeah, there's no doubt that Indian resources and the whole textile industry was moved from India to Manchester at one point. India was the second largest economy, and after it was deindustrialized, it went through 100, 200 years of decline. And it's only in 48 that it, or 47, sorry, with independence, that it begins its rise again. So there's a lot going on in there. Of course, there was the Raj influences, went back and forth, and all of that has fed into the changes that we see. So changes have happened. The other example that I also use in terms of change was when the Windrush generation first come over. I think it's in 1959. I think it's 59. There are race riots in Notting Hill.
Notting Hill, the murder of
and a young man, Kelsa Cochrane, gets killed. And to this day, nobody's been convicted.
That's 59, that's right.
And then, fast forward to the 1990s, the same thing happens to Stephen Lawrence. And then we get the huge Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the reforms that follow after that. So that gives you an indication of how sometimes the changes happen, both at a personal level in terms of families and the marriages that happens at that level of intimacy, and then institutionally as well. We have this huge inquiry that says the Met is institutionally racist. All the other institutions start looking at themselves. We all can also see that there's a backlash against that now to say, oh, we solved all the problems and these things are no longer there. But we can see with the statistics, the disparities are still there. But what others like Tony Sewell are saying is that it's more complex. It's not just black and white. But things are still not where a lot of people would like it to be.
No, and I think you'd be naive if you thought that, if you didn't recognise the fact that white people benefit from the tailwinds of privilege, and people of colour are dealing with the headwinds of being of colour. That seems to me to be reality. It's interesting you talking about the British Prime Minister and the Scottish First Minister, and of course we've also got the London Mayor. You're talking about Asian people that are in very prominent positions. I seem to recall someone reading in the book about this notion of reverse colonialism, which I think is in one of the stories. And I was talking to someone about this yesterday, thinking, yes, I see that, but that seems to be of more of a benefit to Asian people than it is to black people. I don't see so much of that. In fact, if I was to think about, I'd be interested to know your thought on this. I was wondering to myself, would we have had, and I don't wish to be unduly provocative, but would we have had Donald Trump if we didn't have Barack Obama? Is the legacy of Barack Obama Donald Trump, I wonder? And that whole...
Of course it is.
It's hard to argue against that, right?
No, it is because you see it in history. I mean, the great thing about doing the book and having this very long, perspective on the presence is that you can see that every time there's a major advance, particularly in America, every time there's a major advance, there's a massive reaction. So slavery gets abolished in the 1860s in America. That you have Reconstruction, this hopeful moment. There are black African American senators, the congressmen, and people are talking about, is it 40 acres and a mule, and and all of this. And then within 5 or 10 years, the North pulls out of the South and abandons all these people to Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, who terrorized them for the next 80 years. And it's only in the 1950s that we have another civil rights struggle to freedom. So every time there is that moment of opening, when Barack Obama was elected, I said, well, it's gonna come. I didn't know it would take the form of the Tea Party, but I knew it was coming.
But it was felt inevitable to me. I agree. What do you see any themes, recurring themes in either a positive or that's a negative example? Do you see any recurring themes?
Well, the recurring themes are, there's a growing presence of Africans and others in the UK, and then there's a panic, and then there are calls for them to be deported. So this
that's a theme.
Begins from the first Elizabeth. Although that's sort of a complex story which I go into, but you see that again and again. And then there's another group in the 1780s and 90s where, again, during the War of Independence in America, the British got a lot of the African Americans to fight on their side. And of course, when they lost, they had to, we have the case again now, remove those people, as we're trying to do from the people in Kabul who worked on our side. And of course, they end up back in London, abandoned on the streets of London, no resources and everything else. And of course, they, degenerate into this crowd of really poor vagrants, almost vagrants. And then the hue and cry goes up, we need to get them out again. And many of them are rounded up and then resettled in Freetown. There's a scheme to do that. So when the Windrush happens, I'm not surprised. It's just a pattern that happens again and again.
Well, for sure. You wrote a play in that period, didn't you? You wrote a play called Where the Mangoes Grow, didn't you? As a result of Windrush.
I did, and it chronicles actually the rivers of blood up to speech up to
Theresa May.
Theresa May. No, Amber Rudd actually, to her position as Home Secretary, and actually, and if I were going to update it now, I'd definitely add the one about dreaming about sending people to Rwanda. And it's interesting to have someone actually who is brown, who might make racists blush, with the policies they want to enact. But
that takes your breath away.
It's definitely breathtaking, and it's all about this displacement of this individual who is really just so pleased to be British, and he's Jamaican, and he doesn't even he's so disassociated with his own culture. And then he receives this letter, and it just sends him into disarray. He's just so dysregulated. He's so disrupted by it that he doesn't know what to do. And it ends really tragically, but it's all through these audio clips that you hear through the different Home Secretaries talking about getting people out of the country and things of that nature. So it's very strange to that being at home but homeless. It's very, very disturbing. That sense of that, not quite feeling that, I've built a life here. I don't have a connection anywhere else. But actually, at some point, I could be told to leave and go back to where I have no connection to that other place. It's.
But what I liked about C.L.R. James and Jan Carew and Aquino and Mary Prince is that actually, you have to. There is a constant struggle for this African Atlantic space, and part of, for me, part of the challenge now is how do you get us to accept that we co-created this space, and then others to accept that as well. I mean, it seems to me that that's solve some of your challenges about the homelessness, because you're not homeless. I mean, this is something that
I don't think you are.
I know, but this is something
It's
that
crazy, yeah.
that your ancestors paid for in blood and treasure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's important that the claim be kind of made for it, but also in that struggle as well. I mean, I think it's really important to always stress. One of the biggest ever, according to Professor Hakim Adi, one of the biggest ever movements, political movements in this country, was a movement to abolish the slave trade and slavery. And that was led by progressive whites. And so there's always been, allies in terms of making that case. But the case, I think, much more prominently, the case could be made. Between this volume and the first volume, 98, in the first volume, there was just this optimism because obviously Blair had just been elected. And we were all thinking, all of this is over. And everybody thought, Powell was dead and buried, that vision that he had of not being in the EU, that vision that he had of a very centralized state, devolution was going to happen, the Scots, even the Northern, the Good Friday deal was happening. So there was all this stuff. Hong Kong was handed back. So we thought, okay, we're kind of finally end of empire and the country is in a different space. We were all going to be the new people. And then here we are, 25 years later, Brexit, Powell's back.
Powell's back.
Really interesting.
Dressed as Farage.
Really interesting. Listen, it's been a joy to chat with you, and we'll have to end sadly soon. But I cannot tell you how much I'm enjoying Empire Windrush as just some of the essays, and so just an absolute joy. I know I'll go over them again and again and again because they're wonderful. But let me ask you this. What do you hope? What's your hope for the people that are just coming, reading this, and perhaps they're just maybe first time really delving into this story? What do you hope people will get from it?
Well, just that the presence has been longer, the contributions deeper, and it's a co-created space.
Yeah, that's really lovely.
And people kind of need to chill out.
There's a nice point you make in the book, and it was that you were talking about the notion there's always been sort of the advocate. We've had them here at Stonehenge. There's that lovely moment where you kind of suddenly realise when you read the book again, and you read about the Cunard heiress, for example, being on the Windrush, and you go, "Oh, how did that happen?" And it's interesting.
She was always an ally, and and she was what's the word? Her family pushed her out and everything else, but she did a lot of important work in compiling African history. So there were always allies who were around. But in terms of one of the things that I really kind of hope for, it's about that idea of the struggle. That's really important, but also just for, I guess, people to in your section just look at where we need to be going and just be future focused and looking at ways that we can dissolve some of these challenges that are there. They obviously are intractable, but or seem to be, but sometimes they're not. Things move quite quickly. And the thing that also gives me hope is that, the East is rising, and we have been a very important part of how the West was created. The ideas of freedom were defined around us or through us. So if the West has a future, it needs to renegotiate how it deals with its African populations.
That feels like a good place to land.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Onyekachi Wambu, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Empire Windrush, please make sure you go and get yourself a copy of it. It's a wonderful read. Chantelle, thank you. Thank you for your contribution as well. But thank you for making the time to be with us.
She's new generation.
New generation.
So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for a really lovely interview.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been my privilege. Thank you so much.